And instead, I'll just be doing the kind of accepting an Oscar in lieu of and reading her notes for everyone. Before that, I wanted to give a little context. So I'm Ariel Zagno, I should say. I'm the curatorial director of the Museum of Craft and Design and one of the co-curators for Videocraft. I want to give a little context about the exhibition, and then I'll dive into introductions for these amazing artists. Throughout my work, really for the past 13 years, I've been thinking of the interconnections between the kind of tactile, structural, and historic similarities and ways that textiles and other craft practices are connected to moving image technologies. A little background about that is I studied at San Francisco Art Institute and I studied video history there. So I'm really connected to the works of video artists from the 1970s to present. And I also volunteer at Artist Television Access, which is a wonderful little gem in the Mission. It's on 21st in Valencia and has held on by the skin of its teeth for the last 40 years. It was a place where artists could broadcast television, and now we just are a micro cinema showing experimental film. So video holds a really special place in my heart, and I've been at the Museum of Craft and Design for the last 13 years, working and thinking through material processes and craft. So seeing these connections has really fueled me. And I've been struck, particularly in the last several years, by the number of artists who are pursuing similar lines of thought. Craft, video, and film share one way similarity that they share is a complicated exposure to time, whether in a lifetime committed to learning and honing a craft, or to the real time of compressing, editing, shooting, manipulating time to convey an idea. As screens have become a more constant part of our lives in the home and in public, the artists in Videocraft trouble the premise that our interaction with screens are inherently smooth, disembodied, and passive. I think you can point to any work in the show and notice that it has an embodied texture and tactility to be had. And the work on view here beams texture kind of so directly to the eye that you can feel it in your hands. I'm looking at William Cobbing's work right now, and I don't think you can look at that piece without feeling it in your body. There are historic, linguistic, and material ties between textile making and filmmaking. There's ribbons, spools, reels, scenes. You thread a projector. Celluloid was first made from cotton fiber. That's something really interesting. And there are structural similarities in the way textiles and other craft processes are made, and the way in which film and video contain information. Just by way of example, pixels structure, pattern, and image the same way as a quilt would, block by block. Anyway, it's not an exaggeration to say this exhibition wouldn't exist without the practices of the two women who are here with us tonight, both of whom have inspired thinking around the connectedness of craft and moving image. And I want to express my deepest gratitude for them for sharing their thoughts with us. So without further ado, let me just also, before we move on, I had an introduction to Sarah Mills here. This exhibition would not have happened without Sarah Mills. She brought a complexity, a nuance, and a coherence to this exhibition that was lacking. Her thought process, she's an expert of weaving in textiles, and she really brought this exhibition to a place that I didn't think was possible, and I'm endlessly grateful for her, so cheers her when she finally gets here. I know I will be. Okay, let's do this. Beryl Korot and Sabrina Gschwandtner, thank you for making the time to share thoughts on your work. We want to spend a few minutes introducing both Beryl and Sabrina. And we'd like to introduce them by setting some of their achievements in juxtaposition with cultural events, which inform the spaces in which they were working. In July 1970, the first edition of Radical Software was printed. It was the only periodical devoted exclusively to independent video and video art in the early 1970s, and was started by Korot, Phyllis Gershoni, did I say that acceptably, and Ira Schneider. 11 issues were published in total over the next 4 years. In his online essay, Radical Software Redo, David Ross says of the editors, they propose not only a reordered power structure, but also a new information order in which the very idea of hierarchical power structure might be transformed or even eliminated. Radical software would provide a platform for the exploration of alternatives to the dominant mass media structure and would do so in a manner that makes the subjective style of the new journalism with a non-precious, self-published format of the Whole Earth catalog. Readers would be encouraged to copy anything and disseminate it as they saw fit. Radical software, he concludes, is a form of social activism and environmental sculpture. Amazing quote. Radical software emerges at the dawn of new media art and the climax of second-wave feminism. The push for access and decentralization of broadcast TV that the magazine embodied went hand in hand with the dismantling of an established patriarchal order. In 1974, Korot makes Dachau, a 4-channel video work in black and white, with monitors flashing on and off, showing traffic going by Dachau with sounds of laughter, muffled talking, church bells, and a babbling stream. Could we maybe advance the slide, and I'll just tell you when Dachau comes around. Yeah. This is text. Keep going. There we go. Perfect. Every time, this is Sarah speaking, every time I watch it, I can't help but think about Hannah Arendt's famous 1963 publication, A Report on the Banality of Evil. Also in 1974, Korot begins making video and weaving. This parallels the rise of two very separate movements in the art world, the fiber art movement and new media, the latter bolstered by a foundation of conceptual art. Korot is part of both, although these two movements are rarely entangled with each other. In 1993, Korot correlates with her husband Steve Reich on The Cave, a performance bringing together video installation and theatrical opera. Meanwhile, people are starting to surf the web for the first time. 2025, in an homage to radical software, Michelle Cotton curates an eponymous exhibition bringing together women whose art is informed by computing technologies. If we could go back now. Perfect. So, Sabrina Gschwandtner, you studied with some heavy hitters in the film and video sphere, which I guesstimated occurred in the 1990s. Sabrina then went on to publishing the first of 7 issues of Knit Knit, an extraordinary zine filled with manifestos, interviews, and stories about knitting from a range of makers. These issues are now housed in the permanent collections of Harvard University, the New York Public Library, and the Getty. Over the last 2 decades, Sabrina has been awarded residencies in Sweden and the Museum of Arts and Design in New York, Wade Hills, MacDowell, and the Uncommon Art Residency. All this occurred against the background of the art world's increasing support for performance and feminist art and the theorization of craft by Glenn Adamson. His Thinking Through Craft is a landmark book that helped craft find its way into contemporary art. Meanwhile, there were more nods to fiber art and a reopening of the discourse in the exhibition Fiber, Sculpture, 1960 to Present, which showcased older work for the movement and new contemporary art. Out of the many works that now sit in important museum collections, Sabrina's Hands at Work film, made in 2016, was collected by LACMA in 2020. And in 2022, she was commissioned by West Hollywood's Moving Image Media Art Program to create a public art piece that would be seen on a 50-foot digital billboard on Sunset Boulevard. This work she dedicated to 3 overlooked women filmmakers, which is also the title of the work. As Sabrina was not acknowledging important women in history, women and all people really were having their rights revoked in the overturn of Roe versus Wade, ending equal access to abortion across the nation. A topic, among others, which gives another layer of relevance to the conversation this evening. So, now we turn back to Videocraft. This is a question that's kind of a background overview and is addressed to both of you. Some of the early thinking for this show was that craft and video are distinct objects, not usually brought together, especially in an exhibition, but we quickly started noticing and compiled a list of many artists that were fusing traditional craft practices with video and digital technology. So when did you start bringing these media, textile and video, together, and why was that important to you?
the first piece that brought those two elements together was a 4-channel piece called Dachau in 1974, when I traveled to Germany and visited the site of the former concentration camp, which at that point was to me a tourist site. It didn't really have much to do with all the things that we knew about, and it also was at a time when nobody was talking about it. So I kind of went around the camp. It was very, very symmetrical barracks and walkways and crematoria itself, people laughing, playing with their children, life kind of normal in a very abnormal place. Everything was shot on a tripod. I went back to my studio in New York with a lot of this very deadpan imagery and thought, how am I going to bring life to these images and convey a narrative, a nonverbal narrative of what I saw and experienced. Cut to a little earlier that year, I found myself finishing Radical Software, beginning to weave, and making my first videotapes. And one thing that I realized was common to all 3 medium was that they encrypted information in lines. So you build up pattern on the Loom, line by line. You look at the information encoded in a book, and you read it line by line. And video was 525 lines per second, 30 frames a second, line by line. So that was also telling you something about the human mind and how we structure our technologies over vast periods of time, from weaving to, at that point, in the 70s, magnetic tape technology, which was radical software in many ways viewed as a kind of decentralized information exchange to counteract broadcast television. Anyway, so I sat in my studio and I thought to myself, there were some people experimenting with multiple channel video, which interested me because it forced the viewer out of the living room, out of the one relationship, the one-to-one relationship between broadcast television and viewer in the living room. If you had multiple channels in which to view information, you immediately had to take a person out of the living room and into a public space. But then what was I going to program these images with these screens with? And I realized that if I took a simple tabby structure, 1, 3, 2, 4, which is your basic plane weave, and conceived of each of the paired channels, made paired channels, I could take the viewer through this site of the former concentration camp with people riding their bicycles and traffic going on 1 and 3, over the wall inside the camp with people walking towards the barracks 2 and 4, back to 1 and 3, further into the barracks, and so on. Through these pairs of images, the weaving itself kind of created a narrative, the weaving of these images in a very structural way through the camp. And that was the beginning of the relationship I began to see between textiles and the moving image, was literally in how the technology itself embodied and encrypted the information. And that later became part of another work a few years later called Text and Commentary, where I literally wove the work with the camera hanging from the ceiling as I wove, and getting closer and closer to hands moving, tying threads, to the abstract patterns that I was actually creating. Anyway, I could go on and on, but the fact that the Loom was the first computer on Earth, the fact that it programmed abstract patterns in a numerical structure just was very, very important to me, and actually that thinking has sustained my life's work. So that simply, without saying more, was some of what drove me at the time.
I have some follow-up questions, but I want to wait and give Sabrina a chance to answer the same question. When did you start bringing media, textile, and film, in your case, together, and why was it important to you?
I'm so happy to be here with Beryl. I'm so happy to be here with you. We met 2018 or 2019 at a show called Punctures, and immediately went into a photo booth together to take a picture. And we did that again today in a hotel, so that was really, really sweet. Okay, I, like Beryl, this has sustained my life's work as well, and for me it started in college. I studied with Leslie Martin, the avant-garde filmmaker who also refers to herself as a media artist now at Brown. The degree that you at the time had to get to study film was semiotics, and there was a certain amount of theory you had to do before they would let you pick up a camera, so like Marxist, etc., very dense theory. And I was this brief moment in time, a student at this brief moment in time where I learned to shoot and edit on film at the same time that I learned to edit on video. There was no final cut. There was one computer with a Media 100 that we would all have to sign up to use in like a closet, and everyone would race there because nobody wanted the 2 to 5 a.m. editing slot. And so I learned how to make film while I was editing, making it film as video at the same time. So I had the tactile experience, and I also had the digital experience. And I had the experience of just so much dense theory. I lived with 3 RISD students. 2 of them were textile students, and they would come home very late at night and knit and crochet. I'm unusual in my generation in that I did learn to knit and crochet from my mother when I was like maybe 8 or 9, but I mostly forgot, so they re-taught me, and our apartment was so cold. The rent was like $240 a month, and just like the windows were cracked, and we would hang out in the kitchen and knit. And I developed this kind of practice of knitting and crocheting and then reading the dense theory, of knitting and crocheting and reading the dense theory. And so between that practice and working with film and video, I discovered that working with my hands was very primary. And what I loved about knitting and crocheting was working directly with color and texture and working in a really improvisational way, which you can't do, it's much harder to do with video. And so I also discovered that textiles contained in them this feminist content that I was interested in for filmmaking. So I started to figure out how to combine the two, fiber, knitting, sewing, with filmmaking. And I was doing that in college. After college, I worked as a programmer for Ocularis, which is kind of the predecessor to Light Industry in Brooklyn, if you know that. And that scene and the scene of Anthology and other kinds of independent experimental film spaces in New York City I found to be best case scenario, male heavy, male focused, worst case scenario, sites of sexual harassment. And at the same time, there was all of this craft stuff going on. And I was very involved in that because of my zine and knit. And, you know, sloppy craft, as Ann Wilson termed it, for Josh Fott's work was going on, and queer craft and DIY craft. And those spaces, frankly, were safer and were inviting for me, physically safer. And so I just continued on with them. And parallel was still working with Ocularis and doing that kind of work too, but always felt the straw towards craft, both for the feminist content and also for a sense that this was a space that was comfortable for me.
Thank you, and you've queued up this next question brilliantly. So the fiber art movement and new media discourse were roughly contemporaneous, yet overlapped very little in discourse. Did you feel, and this is mostly for Beryl, did you feel your work was part of the conversations happening in one area or the other, or both of those movements? Or was there another train of thinking that you felt more connected to? And then I have like a secondary question, which came from Sabrina a little bit, or paraphrasing, but was new media simply an invite-only boys club? I can break it down. The first was, do you feel like your work was part of the conversations happening in new media or fiber?
It was definitely located in new media, tremendously so. A matter of fact, the fact that I was introducing the structure of weaving to the programming of multiple channel images, though everybody thought it worked, nobody knew what the hell I was talking about, nor were they interested. Because weaving, at that point, was still very pejorative. We thought about, it was the divide between craft and high art was very strong. There was really, Annie Albers was somebody who was out there who I felt, finally she's come into her own in terms of recognition. But at the time, I thought, oh my gosh, this woman who's doing this brilliant work is discovering the brilliance of the Peruvian weavers, is creating technological invention in the whole interior design world, and yet is being pushed aside as, what, a craftsperson, or, so I grew up actually pushing away, trying to both bridge the gap between art and craft, but also very aligned to a movement in video that was also pushed aside in many ways as video art. You weren't really an artist at that point if you were working in video. You were a video artist, so that was the context.
We were thinking about that a lot in the early phases of kind of formulating the show, was this idea that both craft and new media were seen as underdogs in the kind of fine art world for a period of time. That actually was heavily in our first draft of the wall text and got edited down a little bit, because we realized that what we really wanted to focus on was the way that these works fuse those two mediums together, and less about their historical background kind of as fighting for space. But I do think it's interesting to think of it from kind of a gendered lens, because so much of weaving and so much of craft work is traditionally done by women.
It was also very cool, though, at that time. Anybody involved with video and the first issues of Art and so forth, it was almost also like a how-to thing. People were always asking one another, how do you do your editing, all of that kind of thing. So in viewing video and weaving as part of a technological continuum was super important to me. And also, women weren't usually thought of as being technically adept at that point. And you talk about tactility. That was so crucial to me in understanding that the more advanced we got with these instant retrieval and storage systems, the further away we were going from tactility in our own, in that new technological world. And so my compensation for it was that I would never go into an editing studio and have anyone edit anything for me. That everything was going to be hand. That in the early days when you edited, you had your magnetic tape, you had a yellow grease pencil, you had your stopwatch, and you watched where your little X mark would go so many seconds. It would measure like a tape measure, like measuring a dress. Go past, and then you snap the button down, and you get your little in and out section. And to keep the hand in it in such a tactile way was kind of my way of staying in that other world while I was in another world.
I think a few kind of responses to that. I think one is we tend to think of video as just inherently less embodied than film in an interesting way, but so much of analog video, like the glitches it's a physical glitch. It's two lines not interlacing correctly. So if you think about a VHS tape and you have those kind of those snowy black and white lines that don't mix up, that's a physical glitch in the tape, which is just incredible. It is of the hand as film is. The other thing I thought of is that technologies in terms of textiles were always passed down woman to woman in a matrilineal line. And Sabrina, you mentioned your mother teaching you knitting and crocheting. There's something so interesting that, Beryl, you were continuing that line with Radical Software and teaching the technology, opening it up for more people to be able to use. Sorry.
One of the things about the early 70s was that anything was possible. So I actually co-started Radical Software because I had been working at the New York Review of Books, and somebody came up to me and said, we were all in the context of people talking about this new technology and whatever, and somebody said to me, well, you can start a magazine, you work at the New York Review of Books. And I thought, oh, of course I can start a magazine. So there was this amazing support from the zeitgeist of our times, really, that allowed you to do that kind of thing.
I mean, you could say that the present day we have all the resources at our fingertips to make a magazine or to make an online publication, but it also takes a lot of gumption and a lot of smarts and a lot of ability.
Well, it also seems so primitive now, and I think that the information environment, which is what Radical Software is about, was the one-way transmission system, which I mentioned before, from broadcaster to the person in their home. And one of the people, Ira Schneider, who was one of the founders of Radical Software, had a brilliant idea at a certain point when those of us who are artists and wanted to get back to the actual making of the video works, our own work, was to farm out issues to people throughout the country to do so we sent them production money, and they could express themselves. And when I think about it, it was like those were early websites, in a sense. So that the magazine also had this very open-ended model of information exchange. But the information environment we have now through the web became something that we could never have imagined at that time in terms of the complexity of voices. We were talking about decentralization and access because broadcast television meant everything. Now, the information environment is completely different. But I've often thought, as the years have gone by, that it was too bad as things were developing and the online world began to envelop us, that it's only recently that there's been a kind of Radical Software critique, but nothing in all those years where it became so powerful.
I just want to mention for those who haven't seen it, all the issues of Radical Software are online. Is it radicalsoftware.org? Something like that. Yeah. I was looking at it in advance today, and one of my favorite things I found was like, it's almost like if it wasn't printed in like a broadside, I would have called it a post. It was like, the Black Panthers need this kind of footage, and it was a list of kind of footage, and it was like, if you have this, please get in touch with us, like ASAP.
It's very practical. In terms of people trying to exchange information at a time when we all felt that the information was so controlled, and how we would go about it.
Yeah, but as someone who, like, for my latest video, I needed protest sound, I just went to YouTube and found, like, the footage, that I wanted, and then I just, like, messaged the YouTuber to say, can I use this audio?
We also had video theater that we set up in the loft where we did Radical Software, and that was to invite anybody from the video community in New York to come to the loft and play their videos. So they could have gone, to the Woodstock Festival, and nobody would have seen everything about the Woodstock Festival if you hadn't been there. But you could come to the Rain Dance. Rain Dance was the group that formed to create Radical Software. You could come to that loft and see this footage, and people were invited to bring whatever. that kind of thing. So it was like an opening up of the personal view.
Which we still need. I'll just mention that at Artist Television Access, we have open screenings the first Thursday of every month, which is exactly that. People bring the work that they've been working on.
We had great hope in it. Public access through cable television. I think it's cable television.
All right, I'm going to get back on the script here. What's striking about both of your works is the juxtaposition of media forms in a single work. You have both a video and a sculptural object. As a viewer, my experience is like eavesdropping on two people and watching them individually while also listening to their conversation. So what do you find interesting about this between media space? It is, I mean, it's interesting. So both, I think sculpture may be an odd word, but in both there is this option of both watching a video and interacting with something that is more tangible or tactile or takes up physical space. And so I think the question is, it's what do you find interesting about this between media space, but maybe how are you thinking about that?
Well, there was one piece, well actually, I mean, Text and Conjure was all about that. It was about taking four different elements, the images that were shot from the ceiling, of me weaving, and then making a pictogram of the entire work, and then showing the weaver's notation. So four languages, in a sense, coexisting in a room, because in a way I was saying, how do we know anything without multiple sources of information, multiple points of view? So that's what that piece is. And other pieces I've done, there was another piece based on the Babel text from Genesis, which was an early text about technology through the development of bitumen. Everyone talks about it, people were confused, that's what Babel is. But Babel actually was about this thing that bound burnt bricks so you could have cities and more sturdy edifices that brought people together. And then in bringing people together, what did they do with that power? So were we moving, and this is like secularism and religion, all in that text, you move from a God-centered world to a human-centered world. And then there was a piece that I did where I made a scroll based on that text and animated it. So you're looking at the text and the scroll itself and its animation. So, you know, both worlds.
A lot of my work comes from archives and an archival impulse. For 9 years, I worked with 16mm educational films that were deaccessioned from the Fashion Institute of Technology, given to Anthology Film Archives. The archivist looked through that box of materials and kept some material and gave the rest away. So he called me and he said, Sabrina, I have some material I think you'd be really interested in. And these were movies that FIT used to show in their classes, and no one shows film in classes anymore. And the material had shifted in color, so 16mm film, particularly film that was printed on a certain kind of stock. It will change color, it will vinegar, especially, and that process is accelerated if it's kept in conditions that aren't stable in temperature and humidity, and that's what had happened. So there were two reasons FIT gave the footage away. One, no one was using the film projector. Two, the film didn't look like it was supposed to look when it was first printed. And so Andrew Lampert, the archivist at Anthology, was right. I was incredibly interested in the material. It all had to do with women making textiles. And this was 2009. So that was the moment where film projectors, movie theaters were switching from film to video. So I felt sad about receiving this material for two reasons. One is like film was being devalued, but also nobody, like FIT wasn't interested, Anthology wasn't interested, like no one was interested in this footage, which was, to me, very important. It was like, look what these women are making. And so I started work, I made film quilts and video quilts for like 9 years with that material. So And when people see my film clips, they think that I've cut up like the only footage, like the only version of that film. And that's partially because not a lot of people know about film anymore. My son knows about, he's 15. He knows what it is that his friends don't. And so I always have to tell people like, oh no, like I took this material and I sent it to a lab and they made a negative and they make more prints for me. And but it's very important in my work to show film as a material, but also to show it in its moving image form. So this is back to your question, like why the two things, why the object and the screen. And also I'm pulling out pieces from when I worked with that body work for 9 years, I was pulling out things that I was interested in. So I have my own archive, but I'm not an archivist. That's not my role. My job as an artist, as I see it, is to make new meaning with this material. So I'm cutting it, I'm sewing it, I'm taking out what I think is interesting, and sometimes I'm honoring the material, sometimes I'm critiquing the material, I'm adding in other materials, sometimes I shoot material to put in. And so all of that labor, that craft is very foregrounded, I think, in both the video versions and the film versions. You know, it's like my hands. It's very obvious that I'm the one weaving holes, you know, creating a structure, but with gaps, because I did, after that body work, I did another body work of looking for the films made by the earliest women working in film from the late 1800s to the 1930s, and it's incredible how much is gone. You know, it was incredible that I was able to find a few things, but there's something about the preciousness of what I've found or I'm working with that I want to foreground, especially in its physical state.
I'm going to move to this question then, Sabrina, for you, which is, you are tackling so many important feminist issues in your work. Could you discuss a little bit more about how you approach them through your process, and also about like abstraction in that process?
One of the things that drew me to handcraft was that it's really pleasurable. It's just really, I love the meditative and the tactile aspects of sewing and knitting and crocheting and embroidery. And I think I was very much influenced by Leslie Gordon, my mentor's approach to filmmaking, in which pleasure and critique were intertwined. So, wait, what was the question?
Feminist issues.
Right, okay, here we go. Back to this, yes. My most recent body of work was about the overturning of Roe v. Wade and looking back to how, like, when Roe v. Wade was overturned, I thought, okay, how did women deal with this? Here we are again, you know, my mom dealt with this. I started hearing all these stories from friends, relatives about their abortions that I had never heard before, and their illegal abortions and what happened, how they were able to acquire them, and what that experience was like. And that just felt like such a dark moment. And so I thought, well, I'm gonna look back to really early, like thinking, how did women survive this period? This is what we have to do now. And looking back to the earliest films that had anything to do with pregnancy, childbirth, abortion, there are so few. They're directed by women. There's so few. And I looked back before the Hays Code. The Hays Code was started to be enforced around 1934, and the Hays Code was a bunch of like old white guys who said, "Oh, we're not going to allow childbirth, abortion, even pregnancy into movies," and that lasted until 50-something. That was like decades of cinema. And so, you know, this is like pretty depressing research to undertake. And I literally found two films that fit this criteria, and they're both, to me, sort of joyful. And it was really important to me doing this body of work that there was some hope. Yeah, so that's kind of where I've landed with that. Otherwise, it's just too dark. Yeah, that's fair. Beryl, do you consider yourself a feminist artist? Do you consider the work that you do feminist?
You know, I never really think about that except in the way that every woman in my family worked, including my grandmother, who supported the family when the family lost everything in the Depression. She was an amazing cook, and she cooked her way out of the Depression for the whole family. And my grandfather loved to go to the Lower East Side and go shopping for her for all the food. And he was a rare book collector, so he had a bonus there that he would hang out. And I lived with them until I was 6 years old with my family. And then I had aunts, everybody, all the women were, so I guess I just felt, and then in the early days of video, because there wasn't a hierarchy in that particular field, I think that the women who worked in that field early on, I don't know, maybe it changed as things developed a little further, but in that early years, men and women were in it together, from my experience. So that was really where
That's such an interesting perspective because I think we think of all of art history as exclusionary in a way, and it's interesting that maybe at the kind of nascent stages, there is an equality there that we're not paying as much attention to.
I don't know, I guess I also, you know, as everybody has their own, I don't try not to over-politicize.
Fair enough. We don't need to do more of that.
We live in it, yeah.
This is another of Sarah's questions because it pertains to students and I'm having a hard time paraphrasing it just on the spot right now. So she says, color is something that I find difficult to explain to students. I also think a lot about the weaver's Annie Elmers, who rarely used color in her work. Beryl, your work also tends to be black and white and earth toned. So Beryl, could you talk a little bit about your thinking of color or its absence, or astounding presence, as in Judas Cup and the Three Tales Rodney Brooks?
Actually, just as a PS to this conversation, so yes, I started in video and did it a great deal, except for a period of time in the 1980s, where I wove my own canvases and created a language based on the grid structure of woven cloth, which was an abstract language, but actually could be deciphered and read. So there was that period, and then there was a period of doing these 2 video operas with Steve Reich, and then continuing with these video paintings until around 2010. But I got very tired of working in video and having to have my programs upgraded. It just drove me crazy because my tools were giving me what I wanted. And I was able to create a lot. I mean, you know, once you had all of this digital access to film and video, all within, and drawings, all within a single screen, there was a lot of latitude there. So, but you always had to upgrade. And at a certain point, I wanted to go off screen. And so, since 2010 to the present, I have gotten back to, I did these drawings with digital embroidery, and now for the last number of years, got involved with paper, printing on paper. There was a show at the Frick based on the paintings of Francisco de Zurbarán, and whose work I had become familiar with when I did a video show in Madrid, and so went to the Prado all the time and saw these incredible still lives he did. So this work is actually taking a tiny image from the cuff of his pants that you would never see. You wouldn't see, those are his brush strokes. You would never see those brush strokes if you looked at the painting. But it was through capturing, and this was all online, taking one of the images from the show at the Frick, bringing it into Photoshop, taking a little tiny fragment from it, And then these are 4 feet by 6 feet. Then literally making a loom by putting a piece of tape across the table, cutting up threads, and then weaving them, and then putting them together, which, by the way, I called the binding sutures, and later found out that you used that in a whole other way. Mine was literally like sewing up a wound. But you used it in a filmic context, so I always thought that was a kind of interesting thing. Anyway, I'm drawn into the world of weaving now more and more.
Well, it occurs to me that this is the same theme that you comment on in text and commentary and in Eddie and here is this kind of trifold practice of paper media or print media, weaving, and video, but we'll go with like maybe Photoshop a little bit in that it's 3 ways of encoding information slightly differently, but also similarly.
Each one with a very different time in terms of how time builds up one pattern on the loom, how we read it. Yeah, very different time, but basically what's fascinating is that there's the structural basis of lines that goes through, this is thousands of years, and it's not an accident.
It's so interesting to me, and something I've been thinking about throughout this exhibition, but before, is how the way that we structure information affects the way that we understand information. And that's such a prescient kind of.
So that I guess became my obsession more than some of the things. That link between ancient and modern. That's still, right now I'm working on the cave paintings from Moscow and Altamira and exploring who are these hunter-gatherers.
I can't wait to see that work. Sabrina, can you speak to the sutures a little bit?
Well, there's a film theory term, filmic suture, and it just refers to the way that an audience is kind of sewn into the subjectivity of the main character or the story.
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting because so much of what we're thinking with this show, this idea of the shift away from the disembodied and into really feeling the video in your body, the haptic, the tactile, it seems like you're also kind of sewn in that way, which is not something that I had thought about before. Could I ask you a question about color too? Sure. Quilts are almost synonymous with bright bold colors, and yet you have an interesting way of juxtaposing them with black and white imagery and the black screen. What kind of decisions are you making with color?
Well, I wouldn't say that quilts are synonymous with bright color. And we have a quilt expert in the room, Roger Kirchhoff. Where are you? I'm trying to. That's not true, right?
No, I would agree that it isn't.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of Amish quilts
Right.
that are very muted colors.
Right.
I'm thinking of quilts that are made from jeans. Those aren't brightly colored. So it's funny when you get in these audiences, like do you ever find this, like you're like talking to weavers and they get really into the weeds with the weaving, and I'll talk with quilters and they're like, well, those are quilts. And I'm like, well, because they don't have, to be a quilt, right, Robert, it has to have 3 layers. If it doesn't have 3 layers, it's not a quilt, right?
Right.
Yeah, so, yes. And then I've had filmmakers say, like, I'm not making film. So here we are in the middle. This is a bit of a hard question to answer because I work with color. It just depends on the piece. I have done, do we have, that piece is made with etching ink. I worked with Judy Slatkin, who was a master printer. She was the first woman to graduate from Tamarind as a master printer. And we did some more printing on ink on film. I like to use printmaking ink on film. It helps. I feel like it refers back to this idea that the material I work with, they're prints. These are just film prints. There's many of them. It's not the only one. And the colors are really incredible and bright. That piece is red. So that piece is from a film from 1906 made by Alice B. Lachey, and it features a woman who's pregnant who goes around just grabbing and stealing things she craves, and one of the things she steals from, literally from a child, is a lollipop. And so I painted that red for the lollipop. Can you go to the billboard image? There, yeah, that piece, that's another Alice B. Lachey film I worked with, and this was showed on the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles, which is arguably I think, the most coveted movie advertising space in the world. And the idea was to turn this commercial film advertising space into a site to engage with feminist film history. And so I chose 3 films, one by a different pioneering, overlooked woman filmmaker, and that piece by Alice B. Lachey I chose because it's kind of a double erasure. Not only I studied film at Harvard, I studied film at Brown, I studied film at Bard, and I never heard of Alice B. Lachey. So in my mind, she's much overlooked. Some call her the inventor of narrative cinema because all the guys around her in the late 1800s were basically making documentaries, like shooting things like trains leaving the station, workers leaving factories, and she was like, oh, I want to make a story. And she made what is arguably the first fiction film ever. And that film, the double erasure I'm referring to, is she's been overlooked, but also this is footage of Loie Fuller's Serpentine dance. There's no film footage of Loie herself performing this dance. If you've maybe seen Toulouse-Lautrec's prints of her, but there's actually no film of her. It's all imitators, and dance, I think, couldn't be copyrighted. I want to say the 1950s, but don't quote me on that. That film was shot in 1895, I want to say. And so there's someone else performing Loie Fuller's dance, and that someone actually is named Mrs. Bob Walter, so she didn't even have her own name, she had her husband's name, so there's like all these levels of erasure. So that film, in 1895, there was no color film, it was just black and white, so it would have been hand painted. So I hand painted that digitally, frame by frame. It's like a 3-minute piece. Yeah, I'll never do that to myself again. So those are some of the ways, I will say, it wasn't until later in my working with, let's say, how do I want to say this? I did not know until, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, that until I started really researching more about early film history, that there was a period, kind of like what you're describing in the 70s, where men and women were making film around the world where they could access it. And it wasn't until from the 1800s to like the 1930s, it wasn't until Hollywood was industrialized and really became something people could make money doing that women were pushed out. Before that, there were actually a fair number of women directing movies, but then they were pushed into editing. They were pushed into hand painting the film, coloring the film. These were things that women were thought to be good at because of their sewing experience. They had nimble fingers when doing sewing, so let's stick them over there and have them do this tedious handcraft. So that's related to. And then I've also, I don't know, a kind of cornerstone of my work is the idea that, or the overlooked material culture history that links filmmaking and sewing. So in the late 1800s, the Lumiere brothers invented one of the first cameras, which was also a projector. The way they got it to work was by adapting the part of the sewing machine that allows fabric to go through the machine with brief stops during which the needle makes the stitch. It's the same thing that goes through their camera/projector with brief stops during which an image is either recorded or projected. And then about 30 years later, you have women sewing, and doing editing. And, if you think about, there's a lot of terminology like threading, you thread these, like a steam bag, you can thread a projector. There's a lot of similar terminology between filmmaking and sewing.
Yeah, there's so many kind of shared histories between textile and film specifically. We are out of time, but we want to open it up for a few questions for the audience. If you have time to spend with us, please, we very much appreciate you all staying. So does anyone have any questions for Beryl or Sabrina? Yeah.
My question is primarily for Sabrina. I'm curious about how you construct, or when you're working with an archive, are you going into that archive with a specific idea for a piece in mind and you're looking for something that fits that, or are you taking inspiration from those archives and formulating your artworks?
It's specific. I work with, there's an incredible resource that a professor at Columbia named Jane Weems started called the Women Film Pioneers Project that I was very lucky was started and has been expanding since I got really interested in early women in film. So I mostly use that to research when I'm looking for a particular topic. And then when I find who's made work about that, then I go out to archives to see who has it. Often I'm disappointed, like there were these sisters, these Mexican sisters who made early documentaries. Their films seem to have burned in an archive fire. There was a woman from India who pioneered special effects. I couldn't find her work in any archives. So I have to find the material. And then when I've licensed material from like the British Film Archive or Film Pathé, or then they make me sign contracts because they're used to dealing with a broadcast or a film going into a theater or film festival. So they're like, well, we're going to license footage to you. And I'm like, well, I'm going to cut up what you give. They send it to me as a video file. So I pay them for the video file, and then I send that video file to the lab that I work with, and they make a negative and as many prints as I need. So that gets really tricky because they're like, we don't understand what you're doing, we don't understand how to charge you. So that gets, but I also have done, I've gotten some film from the Library of Congress that was royalty free and used that for my work too. But the answer to your question is, it's always something very specific that I'm looking for.
Hi there, thanks for a wonderful discussion. We're both early adopters of media technologies, and we're facing a big leap right now in media technology into generative AI and so on. I'm curious how you're thinking about that, if anything is exciting you, scaring you.
About AI?
About generative AI, because you both you're early adopters of media technology, so is the generative AI leap with media, film media, and images, is it giving you new ideas or fears? Both.
Well, I guess about 20 years ago, I did a work with Steve Rush called Three Tales. And the Three Tales, the last tale was about Dolly as in clone sheep, but it also dealt with artificial intelligence and bringing technology into our bodies and all of that. And it was told from the words of Ray Kurzweil, Marvin Minsky, Rodney Brooks, Cynthia Brazil, who was creating a robot at MIT at the time, Bill Joy, who said something like, if we're going to create a species that's smarter than us, we better take a vote first. So I guess, and it kind of fed into my radical software attitude, I feel like everything is moving way too fast for me. And there's not much of a discussion. Everything is already money-based. So my only thought is slow down. And I don't know how that's possible, given how enamored we are with technology and how much money there is to be made. I find it disturbing that we're not more informed population about what are the pluses and minuses clearly there are pluses, but clearly there are minuses, and what are those minuses, and how do we contend with all of it? Anyway, people a lot smarter than I were a bit worried, and other people just, I think it was Richard Dawkins said something like, once there was carbon-based man, now there's silicon-based man. I guess I feel a little bit sentimental. So, I don't think it answered your question, but.
I've been envisioning like a feminist AI that has records. Well, it's carbon neutral. So this is just a fantasy. And then everyone's like home movies are digitized, and everyone's like I can access pictures of everybody's quilts in their house all over the world. That would really help me out.
Thank you for the talk. I have a question that's maybe a little silly, but as someone that's like at the more nascent stages of my career as a fiber adjacent artist, I'm always really humbled when I see when I see like inklings of the subject matter and methodologies that I work with now in the crafts I make as a child, or the things I was attracted to in high school. And I was really struck by the double entendre of having a journal called Radical Software as an artist that ended up moving from, for lack of a better term, new media to old media, and then finding a space in between. If we I guess take like a sort of Sartesian approach to the idea of radical software as something that's, fibrous and could be worn and is subversive. I'm just curious if that play on words was, on your mind, or if there's any examples of ways that your early work as an artist or a student, was prescient or predicted the sort of work that you ended up making. Does that make sense?
Well, radical software in the very beginning, we were actually talking about programming, not software as it's come to be known. Like, what kind of programming do we want to put on that's different and that will change the information environment we're living in? It was kind of like that. Then my piece, Text and Commentary, actually, I think brought a lot of all of these elements together, because it was drawing and weaving and video all together in a way that I kind of formed a trajectory for all my future work in terms of bringing these different materials together. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the question was, to answer more clearly than that.
I guess I was curious about the double entendre of the name Radical Software.
Yeah, it was we were thinking about creating an alternative information network at the time. That would be the software. What were we going to come up with that would be different? And that's where, for me, multiple channel work was kind of an antidote to the work as one channel TV type of thing. But it was kind of that kind of question. What is the information that we want to see and hear, and what's useful to us? What's ecological media ecology? We were kind of thinking about what's nutritious information. So.
And that's kind of crafts, no? Like when I started Knit in 2002, the big question was, is craft art? And it was like basically a way for people to say no. Like they wanted to ask that question and be like, no, it's not art. And it just didn't generate very many interesting conversations. And you referenced Glenn Adamson's book from 2007. He posed the question instead, if craft is the answer, what is the question? And he's also said, craft is not a movement or a field, but a set of concerns implicated across a variety of media. And I love both of those things, those statements, this question and the statement. And I think that right now you're talking about craft as a plea for slowness in terms of AI, right?
No.
Well, I'm saying that. Okay. Yes, you're not saying that. I'm saying that. I'm extrapolating that. I'm saying craft is slowness, craft is labor, craft is care, craft is community, craft is connection. And to me, that's how those things are related. We have time for one more? Yeah, one more.
Hi, Beryl, you spoke a little bit about your new work. Can you tell us a little bit more of what you're working on now and what drives it? And Sabrina, the same question to you.
Right now, actually, I'm exploring the paintings that were made 25, well, let's say 11,000 to 35,000 years ago from the caves. I'm printing, I'm weaving them like that Zubron piece. There may be a little bit more sculptural. And I'm reading a book called The Creative Explosion, actually, which goes back to that period of time and has us thinking about what it might have been like to only be 10 million people on Earth in the midst of hundreds of millions of animals much larger than us. So, and what it is to hunt today, and all of that. So that's kind of the mixture of things that are going into my current work. But the manifestation is, again, you know, kind of the computer, my fabulous printer, my hand, my tape that all these strings attached to, and classical weaving with this paper. That's what I'm doing.
I'm hoping to continue the work that I've been doing on women's bodily autonomy, and the piece I just finished and showed has those two pre-Hays Code films that deal with these issues, and then it's intercut with, or it's put together with an interview with my mother about her illegal abortion in the 1960s. And I'd like to film, out of necessity, there are now midwives helping women give birth and also have abortions. And I'd like to film them and keep going with this kind of storytelling.
All right, I want to thank you both so much for being so generous with your time and with your thoughts, and for really inspiring all of us in this moment. Thank you. And thank everyone for coming and for spending a Thursday evening with us. We really appreciate it. We hope you come back to the museum time and time again, and thank you.